Good afternoon, everybody. This is Brian Tully, the founder and managing partner here at Tully Law Group, and welcome to our Wednesday webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about how to discuss elder care and estate planning at the holiday table. All right, and we know Thanksgiving's coming up, and we have a bunch of holidays coming through December. So we're going to get into it shortly. Just give us another minute or two, and let some people register and come on in. So give us a minute, please. All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Brian Tully. I am the founder and managing partner for Tully Law Group. Today, we're going to be talking about how to discuss elder care and estate planning at the holiday table. Can be quite a sensitive topic for some people. There might be more sensitive topics for some people, but this is all we're going to focus on today. We are joined by Mr. Tony Farina. If you can join us, there he is. Tony is a partner here at Tully Law Group. He officially joined us at the beginning of this year. And prior to that, he had his own estate planning practice that concentrated on serving families with minor children and high net worth individuals, as well as families and business owners who are facing estate tax issues. Tony's focus is helping clients plan for the rest of their lives, protect tangible and intangible assets, and help them create meaningful legacies for generations to remember. Tony's a husband and a father, and he understands estate planning from both sides of the table. His approach to planning is centered on educating the clients, which is one of the reasons we wanted to get him to join us. First, by translating complex legal topics into easy to understand real life examples. I've seen him do that in person, and it does work. And this helps empower clients to help them make planning decisions that protect their family and their finances. Tony is admitted to practice law in New York and is a member of the New York State Bar Association. Outside of office hours, Tony is probably playing bogey golf, which again, I've also experienced. And he had his first hole-in-one this year, so maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. Watching baseball and spending time, of course, with his lovely family. So Tony, welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. And I look forward to us getting into the reasons about elder care and planning in the holidays. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for being a part of today's webinar. It's a great time of year to start thinking about these things, especially as family starts to get under one roof. So thank you for having me.
No, it's definitely my pleasure for sure. So where I lost my thing here. What we're going to be dealing with today, and I wanted to add something to the title, is it's not only about how to discuss elder care and planning at the holiday table, it's also the why. So we're going to get into that a little bit because it's not, as you'll hear today for our viewers, it's not just about do you have a will or do you have this or where's the money going. There's a lot more to it. So we're gonna get into that a bit. But as we start, Tony, why are the holidays a good time? Why is this a sensitive time? All right, we want to do this respectfully, but why are the holidays a good time to start bringing these issues up?
Well, I think first, in setting some context, planning
Hmm.
is generally thought of as just being for death, but the reality is it's about planning for the rest of your life, right?
Hmm.
It's about planning for the rest of these things. And the truth is, many of these conversations have to be had at some point in the future. It's not an if, it's a question of when, right? We are all going to experience a lot of these things
Yeah.
as we get older. And so when we think of planning, I think of it as a critical opportunity to have that conversation with family and people that we care about rather than having someone else have to make those decisions for us.
Mm.
And in the spirit of the holidays, at least in my family, this is a time where it's maybe once or twice a year where everybody gets under one roof,
Hmm.
right? Right. My brothers are in town, my parents are in town, and that's not even the whole family. It doesn't even think about my in-laws, although the conversations are still the same. So I think with that context and realizing it doesn't have to be such a somber topic. It doesn't have to be such a taboo thing to think about because we're all going to face it. And it's better to plan now than it is to plan when we're in crisis. That's at least how I view it.
100%. I've said for several years now at this point, the the issue of handling things in advance versus handling things in a crisis. If you're in a crisis, there's always going to be a lot more stress. There's going to be less options, and it's going to be more expensive. That's what a crisis causes. I mean, just think of being on the LIE where you're actually going over 30, 40 miles an hour and something happens to the tire or something happens to the battery, right? That's a crisis. There's only a few options and it's going to cost you an arm and a leg. Whereas if the situation was addressed prior, you'll have other options. You'll be able to choose which vendor or professional you want to work with, and it'll be much less stressful. So handling things in advance, 100% is the smart way to go. Now, you mentioned something there a moment ago about, of course, parents, siblings. That's the immediate family. Are I think these topics can also be brought up in the larger context if the in-laws are there, because we're certainly not advocating that families start getting into specifics, right? We're talking about concepts and conversation. So anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think this is not about sitting at the Thanksgiving table asking mom and dad, do you have your will? Have you set up a power of attorney? Have you done this? But it's about coming up with some of those curiosity type questions to help the family figure out, are we prepared?
Yeah.
Right. And Brian, we talk about this all the time,
Right.
but over the next 20 years, it's expected to be somewhere between 80 and $100 trillion, moving from the silent generation and baby boomers to millennials and Gen X and younger generations than that. And so, we have to have the foresight to think about, is there a plan in place for this type of transfer? Is there a plan in place for if there's an emergency situation? And
Mhm.
I talk about this with my own family. In our house, I grew up in a house with three boys. So God bless my mother, raising three of us, all causing problems all the time. And the three of us are outside. We're maybe throwing the football with my kids, and the questions come up. What would happen if something happened to mom and dad?
Yeah.
Right? Is are we prepared to take care of them? They don't live in the same state as us. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, right? It depends on the family.
Hmm.
But being able to talk maybe with your siblings first to say, hey, what's our plan here? Do we know anything about mom and dad actually? Right? Not every family is transparent about everything that's going on. And I think opening up the door to have some of those conversations is what makes this time of year such an important thing.
Sure. And it also allows, I like the sibling idea, in that it allows you to align yourselves. And again, we have to be mindful that not every family dynamic and every child situation is a positive and a good one. You know, we sit with families that have concerns and issues throughout. So in a tactful way, in a prudent way, conversations with your siblings to say, well, has mom or dad, have they said anything to you? Have they, do you know if they've done something? So in my family, for example, same thing, older brother, younger brother, three boys, and my mom, and of course dad. But it was, God bless mom, because she put up with a lot of testosterone growing up with one bathroom in the house. So the me being in this field, I was the one that prompted it, and I was the one that helped them get it done, and I'm the one that's appointed in the different fiduciary roles to help. Not every family has that situation, but my older brother and younger brother, they're aware that mom and dad are taken care of in our unique circumstance. So as we look at the holidays, what would prompt you to start having these conversations? Is it an age situation? Is it a financial reason? Is it a health concern? What would make you want to start talking about these things slowly but surely?
Sure. So I've always taken the position that planning is for everyone.
Mm,
It's not just for the wealthy. It's not just for seniors and people who are experiencing aging. It really is for everyone, because whether you are just getting started out in your life, maybe you have minor children, maybe you don't, or maybe you are in your 90s and you have adult children who are in their 70s, or no children, whatever your family situation is.
right.
I've always taken the position planning is for everyone, because if you do not plan,
Hmm.
New York State has a plan for you.
Mm,
So by not making a decision, you are making the decision to adopt what New York State has planned for you.
right.
And many of the people that I meet with do not like the idea that New York State has made decisions for their family.
Hmm.
So that's on the macro side of it. But to answer the question a little bit more directly, what are some things that make me start thinking about having that conversation?
Hmm.
Maybe mom and dad are now in their 70s. And we start thinking about in their retirement, as we've all experienced these last few years with different inflation and different grocery store prices and different challenges. Does that mean that mom and dad are going to be able to outlive their retirement savings?
Mm,
And about, well, what happens if they needed care?
mm, yeah,
What happens if they needed care right now? We're at the holiday table and maybe we're noticing some cognitive issues with mom or dad, or
yeah,
we're just experiencing, hey, we're noticing that maybe you guys might need some additional help. On
sure.
the elder care side, I think that's an opportunity to start thinking about that planning.
Hmm.
And if you are in what we sometimes refer to as the sandwich generation, right? You're taking care of yourself,
Hmm.
taking care of kids of your own,
Right.
and then you also have aging parents who may need some assistance. And how will you juggle the career, the work, the kids?
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, your responsibility is taking care of your parents as they start to get older.
Sure.
And just starting to think about those things as we get into it is, when is the right time to start planning? If you don't have anything in place, the best time is right now. And
Hmm.
if you have anything that's older than 5 years, you probably want to have that reviewed. And so at least that's kind of the position I take, if that answers the question.
It does, and you bring up, so that there is, I'm in agreement 100% that planning is for everybody. And there is that reality that if people don't proactively set up their estate plan and set up their backup decision makers, such as powers of attorney and healthcare agents, that the state will do it for you through an expensive, stressful court proceeding.
Right.
So 100% I'm in agreement with that. You mentioned elder care, which of course is what has been my forte for years. We have done webinars and presentations in the past of just different ways and different things that children should look at. So on a practical note, if you have the kids, if you are as a child are going to visit with your parents this weekend or this Thanksgiving or holidays in December, take a look around the house. I mean, to me, that would be a prompting as opposed to just the adult and or the other health issues. But real quick, if you see mail piling up, that can prompt a gentle conversation. If you see prescription bottles starting to pile up or tops off or expired prescription bottles, if you start seeing newspapers, if you start seeing laundry, if you respectfully notice any odors, there's a lot of elder care concerns that when you go and visit, they may prompt the conversation. And we'll talk about it a little bit today as to how to handle that conversation. Um, but that's again on the elder care side. The when we talk about this, Tony, so let's say it's not necessarily an elder care situation, but we're just visiting parents. In either of our cases, we're just seeing our folks. Um, the How exactly would you work on bringing up some of these topics? We talked about siblings, but if you're sitting at the table or you're just, having a glass of wine with dad before dinner, how do you bring it up? What's an effective way to do it without without having them throw everybody out of the house?
Yeah, so I guess there's two approaches, right? The first approach, and I guess the first key is knowing your family dynamic,
Yep.
right? And knowing, I guess what's a boundary and what's not
Mm-hmm.
a boundary in terms of approaching the conversation. And so your first option is to be direct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Your first option is to say, "Hey, mom, hey, dad, have you ever thought about getting your estate planning set up?
Right.
What does that look like? How will we know?"
Yeah.
And the next question is usually mom and dad will say something like, "Of course, we have our estate plan set up. We're all taken care of. You're all set, right?"
Right.
Well, what's the plan if something happens to you, dad? Right? How will I know where to find those documents?
Mm-hmm.
And what attorney did you work with? Did you work with an attorney? The truth is, a lot of plans that we see are significantly outdated. The attorneys may not be practicing anymore,
Mm-hmm.
right? From when you did the documents 20 years ago and checked it off your list, you got everything all set. And so when I think about being direct, it's just asking, have you ever thought about getting your estate planning set up?
Right.
Do we have a plan to
Mm-hmm.
to make sure you're taken care of the way you want to be taken care of if something happens to you?
Sure.
And not asking, I guess this is a more option two, a more subtle way to do it is, you know, mom and dad, who would you want to step in to help you if you needed some help with your finances, or if you needed some help with paying your bills or dealing with healthcare decisions?
Right.
And just, do we have that plan in place?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think ultimately that's the best way to do it, is to be direct but not be demanding, if you will.
Agreed, agreed. And with that, I'm just going to add a word, and it's respectful. So it's not demanding, and we'll get more into it. It's not about money. It's not about what am I inheriting. It's not about those things. But I would encourage those that do have these conversations. If dad respectfully tries to push you off and say, nope, it's taken care of, I've got it, there needs to be another conversation. Maybe that's enough to open the door the first time, but maybe the next time you get together, the conversation is, so dad, you'd said you had a plan, but what did you mean by that? Because you can say, I had a friend who went through this with their parents. Or you could say, I was looking at this for me and my family. And you want to get to the point where you know which documents are in place, because as we both know, a lot of people think having a will is the answer. And a lot of
Right.
people think the will is the only document that's needed. And that is unfortunately not true at all. Um, a power of attorney, in my opinion, I'm sure you agree, is probably more important in a practical sense than a will. And again, you and I'll agree, we don't even want clients using wills. There are ways to save time and save money, and that has to do with trusts. So this kind of goes along with the next topic, was that there are always some misconceptions that parents have about estate planning and about aging and about elder care, in thinking that they're good, they've taken care of it, when perhaps they haven't.
Yeah, and I think to build on that even further, it's being direct. There's a difference between that ask of, do you have a will? Do you have a power of attorney? Do you have a healthcare proxy? There's a different way to be direct by showing genuine concern
Of course.
and saying, hey dad, or hey mom, have you thought about getting a plan in place just in case anything ever happens?
Mhm.
We want to make sure that you're always cared for the way you want to be cared for. And my friend's done estate planning, or I've done estate planning, or I sat on this webinar about estate planning. And I think it's something that maybe you want to explore if you haven't done that yet. Do you have anything like that set up?
Right. Right.
And allowing them to tell you about the plan that they have rather than saying, yes, I have one, or no, I don't.
Right.
Because I think people don't like to be told what to do.
Mhm.
I certainly don't like being told what to do. And I imagine that's true about many people. But if you get curious and you ask questions and you allow people to tell you what's actually going on in their life,
Mhm.
I think you will get the results that you're looking for, especially with mom and dad during the holidays, loved ones during the holidays.
Mhm.
You know, do we have a plan for this? If you have siblings, I use that example too. You're talking maybe initially to your siblings to say, hey, do you know if mom and dad have a plan for what happens if?
Mhm.
Hear stories all the time about, so and so had a medical event or an issue, and that's generally a life event that causes people to think about the work that we do.
Sure.
But that's why it's such an interesting time to be curious with your family about what plans they actually have in place.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that just opens the door to a more productive conversation.
It certainly does. And I love the concept of being curious because that's what you're doing it, and you're doing that in a respectful way. Um, and I mentioned it briefly before. It doesn't all have to be solved in one conversation.
Right.
Again, you can open the door a little. Then the next time, and I'm not saying next year, but maybe next phone call or next get together, you kind of open that door a little more. There's the older generation, respectfully, is potentially a little more, let's say, possibly closed off to this topic, thinking it's taken care of, that they've got it that they've got it all under control, and they may not necessarily appreciate the children bringing up these concerns. After all, we are just the children. I would share that stories are always a wonderful way. So curiosity and stories are a wonderful way to open that door and to just introduce the topic. As I mentioned briefly earlier, you know, perhaps you're doing this planning for yourself, or you had a friend, unfortunately, whose mother had a stroke and there was no power of attorney in place, and this is what they're going through. Or there's somebody at work whose parent passed away unexpectedly, and now the family is dealing with this court proceeding called probate, and it's just taking forever, and it's so stressful. And there's ways to help the family save time and save money and save stress. It's always, I think, more prudent to address it, as you're saying, with curiosity
Right.
and step by step. Um, so, and for our viewers today, if you have questions, we're always going to be available at the end of this. So in the chat box, in the Q&A, please feel free to enter some questions, and we'll answer them when Tony and I are done. Is If this conversation is happening, Tony, is there a way or a strategy in which we can make sure mom's a part of that conversation, or if mom's the one that has been handling the financial affairs, and is there a way to make sure dad gets drawn into the conversation? Because it's not meant to be secretive; it's meant to be a conversation for the family. But we want everybody to be a part of it so that the different voices are heard.
Yes, I think, let's say we have an example where one spouse is that quote unquote CEO of the family,
Mm,
right? They manage the finances, they handle all the business, they pay the taxes, and they're the head of the family, if you will, the CEO, as I sometimes refer to it.
right.
Generally speaking, most children will go to that parent first, but whatever planning is done for the CEO also has to be done for the vice president, right? Or whoever's their spouse,
Right.
because a lot of the planning is interdependent on each other.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain needs for the CEO, there's certain needs for the vice president, and some of those needs are exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
The planning may evolve as time and health and assets and taxes
Mm-hmm.
and laws change. So, whatever is decided, if we have a married couple, is generally best if that is happening together,
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
long as there's a cohesive unit. Of course, family dynamics are interesting. No family is the same. There could always be
Right.
spouses estranged from each other, any of those
Sure.
cases. But
Sure.
generally speaking, we want to involve mom and we want to involve dad.
Right.
And if there is a CEO of the CEO of the family will generally be more attuned to making sure that if something happens to me, I don't want this to be the first time that my spouse has to deal with all of these things
Right.
and just quote unquote figure it out when I'm gone.
Right.
That's not making things easy. Most families that I meet with and that we meet with, they want things to be easy for
Yeah.
their surviving spouse
Mm-hmm.
and for their children.
Yeah.
And so I think approaching it with that logical perspective, if that family sounds like your family, is a helpful thing to make sure that both the CEO and the vice president are kind of taken care of in tandem.
100%. And just to echo that very important point you just made there, I can't count how many families and consultations and families I've sat with through the years where where let's say the CEO, as we're calling it, and typically it's the dad, but not always at all, where dad will look at me and it's his agenda to make sure that his wife of 48 years, of 62 years, is taken care of, and it's his agenda to make sure that there's going to be an order and a plan, because if he goes first, right, he's been in this example the protector, the head, so to speak, and the idea of making sure that the family isn't left floundering and perhaps susceptible to predators and other issues is important. Also have sat with a whole slew of folks where the dad doesn't want to address the issues, and it's mom who's encouraging this and making sure the planning is taken care of. And same reasoning, because they're the ones, as you've called it, have been the CEO. And then I'll often look at dad and say, Mr. Smith, with all due respect, this is super important because, if God forbid you go first, and that's generally what happens, we need to make sure these things are addressed. And they'll come around. They'll come around. And that, though, that's further along in the process. That's when you've actually got them to sit down with somebody like ourselves. And when we're doing that, we have to be mindful of every family having concerns. And as I tell folks daily, every family has something. No family is picture perfect. So whether it's addiction or divorce or incarceration or special needs concerns, spendthrift issues, every family's got something. But it's also our job, as we're sitting and talking with families, to look out for potential conflicts and potential risks in the future. One common one that we see, and maybe you can shed some light if you've seen this as well, is let's say that the middle child moved out, got divorced, or perhaps never had a steady job and then moved back in with mom and dad. So now you got mom and dad and Stephen living in the house.
Right.
Now, the older brother perhaps is going to want, once mom and dad are gone, they're going to want that house sold and they're going to want those proceeds split up. But what about Stephen, right? So how do we address those things? Because those conflicts, we want to avoid those conflicts down the road, so we want to document it.
Right. I can't tell you, I'd say at least once a week. I think that's an understatement, but I would say at least once a week, I am meeting with a family who, to some degree, they are providing for one of their children financially more so than they need to for other children.
That's right.
And an example comes to mind, having a conversation literally just the other day with a client about, well, I'm going to use this example. I'm going to change some of the facts so that I'm not singling anyone out in any way, shape, or form. let's say that this particular client had two sons, and one son is often working, he's got
Right.
children of his own, he's doing great financially, there's no challenges. But the other son was in an accident and hurt his back and lost his job, and just is a series of unfortunate events, maybe that have forced son number two, the youngest, to move back into the home.
Hmm.
And the parent is now faced with the idea of, well, I'd always thought about selling the home and retiring and moving to Tennessee or Delaware or Florida or one of these other states, and I could live off this house. I bought it for 70,000. It's now worth 600. That's going to be a great windfall for me when I buy for 300,000 in another state. And then they're faced with, well, now my 32-year-old son needs some support.
Mm.
And I want everything to be equal when I pass away for both of these kids, despite one doing better financially than the other. I don't want to create conflict, right? I don't want to have conflict amongst my boys when I'm gone. And I think if you asked most family members, most families, they would say, I don't care about the money,
Mm.
right? I care about my family at the end of the day. Of course, I'd like to provide a financial legacy for them,
Mhm.
but all in all, I'd rather them have a good relationship if something happened to me.
Right.
Now, if you need to provide for, as we will call him, Stephen, there are ways to do that in your planning documents without significantly alienating the older son, John, we'll call him. There's things like rights to reside. There's timelines that these assets can be there.
Right.
There's ways to hold assets in trust for the benefit of Stephen, who needs assets to be protected from the idea of lawsuits, creditors, bankruptcies, divorce,
Mhm.
spendthrift,
Mhm. Mhm.
financial immaturity, as I sometimes refer to it as, right? They can't have a dollar in their pocket because they'll spend 10. So we can structure plans that account for those types of things.
Right.
But if we don't plan for that, New York's plan says
Mm.
just give it to them outright. And that is generally not what most families want to do. There's some wrinkle in there, and our job is to find that wrinkle so we can iron it out.
Mhm. Yeah, fair. The and plan for it in advance and get the
Right.
folks to buy in, so to speak, and have them implement that plan. On that note, Tony, do you encourage parents to talk to children about their wishes and what their plans say, or do you prefer them to just keep it, behind closed doors?
Yeah, that is an interesting question because I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer to it.
Mm.
I tend to prefer having the conversations while we are all still here and involving the multiple generations, because ultimately, as mom and dad get older, okay, somebody may have to step in to help them,
Right.
which it becomes helpful if we know what the plan was from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So that way things don't magically change in the future, right? Or things don't slip by the wayside in the future. There's no confusion about who's stepping in to handle the taxes
Right.
and pay the bills or make the healthcare decisions. Or when all is said and done, what happens to all the assets? And I'm going to say a phrase. I don't know if you're going to like to hear it, Brian, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Go
I
ahead.
hear it from clients sometimes, and it makes me challenge them and push back. And they'll say things like, I'll be gone. What do I care? And,
I love
and I think by the end of the time people meet with us, they feel differently about that. And I think if we're coming back to what this webinar was scheduled about, starting that planning conversation with that curiosity
it. Hmm.
opens the door for a seamless transition. Let it be 20 plus years from now,
Hmm.
right? When there's a health event, when there's a financial or a liquidity issue, when there is a death in the family or an illness or a medical event,
Hmm.
it makes it so much easier to breathe and focus on caring for your loved one. If your loved one has passed, grieving your loved one, instead of worrying about all this administrative minutia. That's what you have the attorneys for. That's what you have the plan for.
Right.
But without it, it becomes just a mess.
It certainly does, and well said, and I agree with you, and we do hear it, and it's usually the dad that'll say, "Oh, what do I care? I'm not going to be here anyway." So the reality is, it going back to our very first point, the idea of addressing it in advance. So what I wanted to do as we start to wrap up, and again to share that if anybody has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A box. The There's no judgment here whatsoever because Tony and I have been doing this for such a long time. We understand why people postpone these discussions and why the parents and clients prefer not to talk about it. I mean, think about it for a second. We're talking about death and dying. We're talking about health and aging. We're talking about incapacity. We're talking about money. We're talking about children and perhaps them getting along and who likes who and who doesn't. And there's a lot of stressful topics there, which is what, again, we handle and work with every single day of the week. And so does our team. But if we can overcome that head in the sand approach, and that's the point of today, is if we can start having those direct yet respectful and curious conversations over time, perhaps, that we can open that door, open that treasure chest of knowledge and information and reasons and purpose and come up with a plan. I think that we can address these stressful issues in a solid, mature, non-judgmental way. And again, it's yes, it's how we make a living, but that's all about helping families. What Tony and I are both doing here is doing what we wish our own families to do and what we're doing for our own families and our friends and extended family. Have the plan in place. If mom and dad are not yet willing to do so, or not yet have revealed their hand, if you will, then it's time for that direct yet respectful yet curious conversation. Anything to share to that, Mr. Farina?
Yeah, I just think no matter what, your family is going to have to resolve these issues in the future. And so the question is that something you would like to make easy, or is that something that you're okay with being a little bit more difficult? And so ultimately, have an honest conversation with your family. Think about, do we have a plan for this possible thing? And is this what you actually want? Because if we don't have that plan, we have to face it in some of the more difficult times of our life, which will come to all of us.
Absolutely true. And we don't wish that on anybody, but we just know that those things
Right.
can happen. So again, as with all life circumstances, let's avoid the stress, let's avoid the crisis and have that conversation. So thank you, Tony. I think this has been helpful and hopefully beneficial to our viewers. Of course, there'll be a recording on our website, tullylawgroup.com, and our YouTube channel as well, which is Tully Law Group. That's the handle. But if you're listening and watching, and it's you or your family or your friend's family or your extended family, reach out to us. Go to our website. All our phone numbers and forms are there, tullylawgroup.com, and we'll be able to help address these concerns with the family directly. So any questions? I don't see any questions. So that means people still don't want to address it yet, which is fine. Or we did that good of a job, Tony. So we're good. Thank you very much for coming. And again, thank you for being our guest here, Tony. It was our pleasure. And for our viewers, we'll see you next month at our next webinar, dealing with, of course, more of a holiday-based theme. So thank you, and bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone.